Hello once again. In our earlier lecture, we talked about the concept of Vakrokti or obliquity as a concept of Sanskrit poetics, which is used for making assessment of literature, that is Kavya. And we also talked about the Sanskrit acharyas like Bharata, Bahama, Dandin, Vaman, Rudrat, Anandvardhan, Abhinav Gupta, Rajashekhara, etc., who have dealt with the concept of Vakrokti. Today we will talk about the classification of Vakrokti as given by Acharya Kuntak in Vakrokti Jivitam. Acharya Kuntak has classified Vakrokti into 49 sub-varieties, and under 6 major heads he describes the divisions. He had classified these as Varn Vinyas Vakrat, that is phonetic obliquity, Pad Purvarth Vakrat, that is lexical obliquity, Pad Parad Vakrat, that is grammatical obliquity, Vakya Vakrat, that is sentential obliquity, Prakarna Vakrat, that is episodic obliquity, and Prabandha Vakrat, that is compositional obliquity. Here we must mention that the second chapter of Vakrokti Jivitam, it takes up a detailed description and consideration of the varieties of Vakrokti, and different chapters are being taken up for these divisions. Now we have talked in the earlier session also that according to Kuntak, Vakrokti has been considered as the soul of poetry, and that is why the title of his book is Vakrokti Jivitam, because he said that Vakrokti is the life of poetry, and any utterance which is characterized by wit or ingenuity, according to Kuntak, was Vakrokti. And the Vakrat, he refers to the term Vakrat, which actually is separated from poetry as other forms of expressions. And he says that Vakrat does not make poetry. Vakrat obliquity is just to delight the mind of the readers, because readers are responsive to the true beauty of the poetry. So the test of Vakrokti is actually the kind of aesthetic enjoyment which is experienced by the readers. And later on, when he classifies these Vakrokti, he takes up different examples and describes them in those contexts. We take up the first variety, the classification, that is Varn Vinyas Vakrat, that is phonetic obliquity. As the name itself implies, that it is one of it deals with the phonetic obliquity that occurs, and it is one of the 6 varieties of Vakrokti. Kuntak talks about all the possible arrangements of phonemes and consonants in a kavya, and that is how he takes us to the concept of phonetic obliquity. Now he says that the first kind of arrangement is free, and it is irregular repetition of, say, identical or similar varnas, that is phonemes or consonants. And when at varying intervals, when this arrangement occurs, it provides a certain texture and beauty to the expression. Kuntak further divides these phonetic obliquity into 3 sub-varieties. One is the repetition of one varna, then the repetition of 2 varnas, and the repetition of more than 2 varnas. The second kind of varna vinyas, that is Vakrat, it has further sub-varieties. He says that when stops are combined with homoorganic nasals, and when liquids are doubled, and when consonants become conjunct with ra, etc., they include the arrangement of varnas without any such employability. And this is how he calls the third sub-varieties called Varn Vinyas Vakrat. And the fourth variety is the repetition of new vargas. Kuntak says that A discontinuance of earlier repetition of the varnas in poetry and choice of new ones also sometimes impart beauty to the expression. One more thing that he mentions is that chime also falls under this category, but he adds that chime should be affected without an extra effort, and it should be rather adorned with syllables which should not be very harsh, because chime should always be in consonance with the feelings which are conveyed, and therefore they should always be used with propriety. Now, talking about all the sub-varieties of Varn Vinyas Vakrat, there he says that there are innumerable charming effects that are produced by these Vakrat in poetry. But all of them need a certain attention, because there are certain limitations. And Kuntak has mentioned all these limitations in his treatise. He says that the arrangement of varnas, they should be as such that they should not violate any propriety, and they should always be in consonance with the feelings which are being conveyed. And when we adorn the poetry with syllables, they should not be very hard, they should be carefully chosen, should not be tarnished by any unattractive varnas, and also that the writer should beautify his work or poetry by repetition of newer or novel varnas every time. And finally, he also says that lucidity, it should be maintained at all costs. Um, the writers, he says that when they use sub varieties of Varn Vinyas Vakrat, they should be imparted or explored in order to impart beauty to the poetic expression. And therefore, the various kinds of effects that we see in poetry are produced by these certain ways of employment of Varn Vinyas. Now, at the end of this, we just here mention, Kuntak also has mentioned that the rhyme of the ancient mariner, because it's easier for us to understand it that way, it demonstrates a certain sound effect. The rhyme of the ancient mariner is famous for its phonetic obliquity, and this phonetic obliquity is caused by the sound effects used by Coleridge. Say, for example, I just read out a line. We have so many examples in this rhyme of the ancient mariner. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. Now we see that the sound B is indicative, a kind of an explosion, because when he says the fair breeze blew, and F also, the white foam flew, the sound of F, it suggests a movement, because again further he says the furrow followed free. It's a kind of a movement which takes us to quickness and friction. Again we have the sound D, which is repeated in the line day after day, day after day. Now he repeats this line. It sometimes suggests monotony and immobility. So the immobility of the mariners when they are traveling in the sea for long and long and they are not reaching their destinations. I must recommend and suggest the students to read the rhyme of the ancient mariner to further understand, because phonetic obliquity can be best understood by this poem. In our further sessions, we will be taking up further varieties of. Now we have the second category, the lexical obliquity, that is the Pad Purvad Vakrat. It is, Kuntak says that it is found in the basal forms, very low forms of words, and according to Kuntak, he says it comprises of all the effects which are based on the writer's choice of words. The choice, which is sometimes guided by strangeness, sometimes by freshness, and all these they impart strangeness or freshness to writer's utterance through words. And he further says that it is only through words that a kavya or poem, one of the joys, he says, it is made plain, simple, common, strange, evocative, etc. And he says kavya is made rich or evocative by the use of words, and it is a kind of a divine sureness of instinct. And when he says it's a kind of divine sureness of instinct, What he means by this is that it enables a writer to select the appropriate word from the various categories that are available to him. Now, the temperament of the writer also has some kind of an affinity with certain categories of words, and they are also examined. The poetic vocabulary of the writer also makes an imprint, and he realizes that there is an affinity that exists between certain types of the poetic temperaments of poets and certain clusters or word selections which are termed as poetic vocabulary. Kuntak also defines that words of common usages, they are employed to include kind of an association, and this also includes included under the category of Pad Purvat Vakrat. Now there are further sub varieties of this, that is Pad ki kuch varieties हैं. One of them is the obligatory of usage, of synonym, of transference, of adjective, of concealment, of indeclinable, of gender, of verb, etc. We will take up this in our next session.